Hello, and welcome back to Holy Nerdvana, your home for finding gaming zen. In this case, it's by killing witches and their evil minions. Today we're looking at a new early access game. New to Steam, at least. Witchfire released on the Epic Store 1 year ago, and now it has come to Steam. It seems reasonably popular, and it's another game that uses Unreal Engine 4. So we thought we'd give it a look and run some benchmarks on a collection of graphics cards. Testing Witchfire can be a bit cumbersome, depending on how you want to go about it. We first tried launching an expedition and doing some testing there, but you cannot save in the middle of a mission, so that means fighting through any enemies that might get in the way of our testing each time we switch GPUs. We were willing to do that if necessary, but after running around the Isle of the Damned and checking performance in 2 different locations, we determined that the starting base, the Hermitorium, can be just as demanding as various expedition levels. For example, we saw over 400 FPS on a 7900 XTX at 1080p medium settings on the Isle of the Damned, compared to around 320 FPS running about the Hermitorium. Since the Hermitorium requires zero loading and navigating, it's far easier to benchmark there, so that's what we did. Even though the game has been available on Epic for over a year, it's in early access, so we expect things to continue to change over time. This will be a snapshot in time of performance and potential issues, in other words. And with that preamble out of the way, let's get to the benchmarks. We'll begin with 2 budget GPUs, the RTX 4060 and RX 7600 XT. Both cost around $300, and we're testing at 1080p medium without upscaling as our first target. The 7600 XT tends to be a little bit slower, averaging 130 frames per second compared to 136 FPS on the 4060, and both cards are easily capable of handling medium settings. Minimums, however, aren't that great, dropping into the 60s on the 7600 XT and the 70s on the 4060, and these low minimums are something we'll see throughout our testing. Considering where the budget GPUs land, stepping up to the mid-range RTX 4070 and RX 7900 GRE means you can expect a significant jump in performance. These cards cost around $530, give or take, with AMD's card generally offering higher performance in rasterization games like Witchfire. It averages just over 240 frames per second in our testing, compared to about 200 frames per second on the 4070. Bumping up to the 4080 Super and the 7900 XTX, these are high-end GPUs that cost around $1,000, though recently we've seen the XTX on sale for as little as $800. And the results here are interesting because the 7900 XTX has lower minimum FPS but higher average FPS. Of course, this is also at 1080p medium, which isn't where most people that have one of these GPUs likely plan on gaming, which is why they're getting well over 250 frames per second. Last up is the mighty RTX 4090, again compared to AMD's top RX 7900 XTX. If testing the 4080 Super at 1080p medium felt a bit silly, we're fully into ludicrous territory now. Who would spend almost $2,000 on a GPU to run it at 1080p medium? But stranger things have happened, and the RTX 4090 cruises along at over 330 frames per second. Here's the full chart of performance results, and pay attention to the 1% lows. The GPUs stack up in a pretty typical manner, with the 4090 on top at 337 FPS, then the 7900 XTX at 322 and the 4080 Super with 287. But look at those minimums. Despite having a 45 FPS advantage in average performance over the 4080 Super, minimums on the XTX end up 13 FPS lower. That's probably part of the early access nature of the game, even though it's been an issue since at least last September. AMD's 7900 GRE easily beats the 4070, but again the 1% lows indicate there's a lot of framerate inconsistency, with minimums less than half of the average FPS. And the same goes for the 4060 and the RX 7600 XT, where both got over 130 frames per second but with minimums dipping all the way down into the 60s to 70s. Okay, that's enough of this 1080p medium talk. Let's push the GPUs a bit harder with 1080p Ultra settings. Starting again at the bottom of the stack with the RTX 4060 and the 7600 XT, frame rates definitely take a hit. These GPUs are now getting in the mid-90s to maybe 105 frames per second, about 25% slower than at 1080p medium. The 4060 still has the performance advantage, about 9% faster than the AMD GPU, and minimums again dip quite low, dropping into the 50 FPS range. The RTX 4070 and RX 7900 GRE fare much better, still easily breaking 140 frames per second. But even though they're getting high average frame rates, the minimum frame rates remain relatively mediocre at around 100 frames per second. Most gamers wouldn't complain about that level of performance, but in context we're seeing regular swings from the high 100s down to 100, and that will manifest as microstutter. Let us show you what we mean. Here's the full view of frame rates over time for our benchmark, and you'll notice the large vertical orange spikes, as well as some big blobs of orange in the middle of the chart as well as at the end. That's where the stuttering took place on this particular benchmark run. And here's a zoomed-in view of the 3 seconds in the middle where the stuttering was most severe. The average frame rate over this sequence is 210 FPS, but there are almost continual swings between around 125 to 140 FPS at the bottom, and 400 to 500 FPS for the highs. We promise you, this is not a good experience and it's something that needs to be fixed. Whatever the game is doing here, it's very much not optimal. Okay, back to the comparisons. Up next we have the 4080 Super and 7900 XTX. These cards are still getting over 230 frames per second on average and are basically tied. But as with the other GPUs, there's plenty of microstutter happening that this 60 FPS YouTube video won't properly convey. And you could try capping your GPU to 120 FPS or similar to help mitigate that, but fundamentally this is a game optimization problem. And then there's the RTX 4090, which is probably still hitting a CPU bottleneck. It's outperforming the 4080 Super and 7900 XTX, but only by about 15 to 20%. Average performance lands at 275 frames per second compared to 234 on the XTX, which seems like a rather sizable lead if you ignore the cost and the fact that at higher resolutions, the gap can reach 35% or more. Looking at the overall 1080p Ultra chart, these are pretty typical standings for these graphics cards when running games that aren't using ray tracing or upscaling. The hierarchy of GPUs ends up as you would expect, with the 4090 at the top, then 7900 XTX and 4080 Super are basically tied. There's a big 25% or so drop to the 7900 GRE, which leads the 4070 by about 15%. And then at the bottom, about 35% below the 4070, we have the 4060 that often outperforms the 7600 XT, particularly when a game doesn't need more than 8 GB of VRAM. Here it's about a 9% advantage. Those standings might shift slightly at higher resolutions, but already Witchfire is mostly limited by CPU performance on our Core i9-13900K. Let's move on to 1440p Ultra, still rendering at native resolution with no upscaling. Witchfire does support FSR2 and DLSS3 upscaling, along with XESS, NIS, and TAAU, but will hold off on upscaling tests until 4K. At 1440p Ultra, the 4060 and 7600 XT are still getting 60 FPS or more, but just barely in the case of the 7600 XT, with minimums dipping down into the 30 FPS range. That's definitely some micro stutter that you'd feel. The 4070 and 7900 GRE still average over 100 FPS, still with a 12% advantage for AMD's card. As with the budget cards, minimums fall much lower, dipping into the 60 to 70 FPS range. So if microstutter bothers you, you'd want to lower the settings or use upscaling. And we'd like to think that being early access means we'll see more frequent updates to the game, but looking back over the past year it seems like a lot of these performance issues have been ongoing. For the high-end 4080 Super and 7900 XTX, performance is basically tied, this time with the 4080 Super coming out just ahead of the XTX. But it's only by 2 frames per second, 165 versus 163 FPS, and the XTX has better minimum FPS at 97 compared to 86. So that's a win for AMD in our book. And then at the top, the RTX 4090 takes on all contenders and wins, with a 23% lead over the 4080 Super now. That's still not into the 30 to 50% range we see when games are fully GPU limited, which is just how much potential the 4090 has compared to the competition. It has 83 teraflops of FP32 compute compared to 52 teraflops on the 4080 Super and 61 teraflops for the 7900 XTX. But you need a demanding game before you'll fully realize those gains. The overall 1440p Ultra chart shows the same standings as before, except the 4080 Super and the 7900 XTX swapped positions. But notice the 1% lows on the Nvidia card, just over half of the average FPS. That's not something you want to see. Hopefully, as the game gets more updates and improvements, the developers will correct the micro-stuttering and dips causing the large swings in performance. With those charts we showed earlier, ideally you want the FPS lines to be as smooth as possible without a lot of spikiness, which indicates frame rate inconsistencies. But we're not done, as we still need to try and run 4K Ultra. The 7600 XT and the 4060 clearly struggle at this demanding resolution, getting just about 30 frames per second. The 8GB of memory on the 4060 looks to be holding it back a bit as well, so that its 1% lows are worse than on the 7600 XT, but neither card does a great job at native 4K. And that's to be expected. You get about double the performance by moving up to the 7900 GRE, which again outpaces the RTX 4070 by 11%. The 61 FPS average is decent overall, but minimums dip down into the 30 FPS range, and on the 4070 we're even seeing sub-30 dips. So that's where you'd want to look at upscaling, and we'll get to that in a moment. The high-end 7900 XTX and 4080 Super are still cruising along at roughly 90 frames per second. Nvidia's card has a higher average frames per second again, but quite a bit lower minimum FPS. 1% lows are 41 on the Nvidia GPU compared to 52 on AMD's XTX. That means that even though the 4080 Super comes out 2 FPS faster on average, having 21% lower minimums in general makes it a worse experience. Finally, we have the 4090 with just over a 30% performance advantage over the 4080 Super, and 34% faster than the 7900 XTX. It's definitely at the point where we're pretty GPU limited, and it's the only card that's delivering over 60 frames per second on both minimums and average FPS at 4K native. The minimum FPS ends up 68% higher than on the 4080 Super, likely thanks to all the VRAM. Our 4K chart shows just how much VRAM capacity and bandwidth start to matter at higher resolutions. Minimums on the 4080 Super took a big hit compared to the 4090. And the RTX 4070 and 4060 also have pretty poor minimum FPS. Witchfire remains playable on the 4070 and above. But you'd probably want to tweak the settings or turn on upscaling to help smooth things out. The game also supports DLSS3 frame generation, which we'll talk about momentarily, but let's look at the upscaled 4K performance first. The RTX 4060 and RX 7600 XT still have a similar level of performance, but the 7600 XT now takes the lead by a few frames per second. That's almost certainly thanks to its having 16 GB of VRAM, as even with upscaling 4K can use more memory. Minimums also smooth out more on the AMD GPU, sitting at 35 FPS compared to 28 FPS on the 4060. And we won't show it here, but turning on frame gen bumps the minimum FPS on the 4060 to 35 as well, but the average FPS actually drops. That's not how it's supposed to work, so chalk that up as one more item for the game developers to address. There's no real change in standings with the 4070 and 7900 GRE. The 7900 GRE is clearly the faster card, by 25% here. Both cards do a good job with upscaling, but AMD provides a smoother experience. Frame gen, as with the 4060, boosts the minimum FPS but doesn't help the average performance, which means after you consider the halving of input sampling it ends up as a net loss. The 4080 Super and 7900 XTX gets interesting because FSR2 upscaling isn't as complex or as nice looking as DLSS upscaling. AMD gets a bigger performance boost from upscaling with the XTX than Nvidia gets with DLSS on the 4080 Super. That results in AMD taking a lead in both average and minimum FPS, 162 compared to 148. But the 4080 Super does look better with DLSS upscaling, so that's not an apples-to-apples comparison. And wrapping up with the RTX 4090 running at 187 frames per second on average, that's only 15% ahead of the 7900 XTX. Compared to 4K native, the 4090 got a 57% increase in performance with DLSS upscaling, while AMD nets an 82% improvement from FSR2. We don't expect anything to catch the 4090 other than the upcoming RTX 5090, maybe even the 5080 as well, though the XTX is actually pretty close in this case. And the last thing we want to show is 4K upscaling and frame generation with the 4090 compared to just upscaling. We have the frame gen mode on the right, and upscaling only on the left. What you'll see is that the 4090 with frame generation ends up with lower average FPS. And as we said earlier, that's not good because your actual experimental frames per second is half of the shown frame rate. The game only takes input on the fully rendered frames, then generates intermediate frames using AI, adding a couple of frames of latency. So it's often not a great experience. Our final chart has both the upscaling as well as upscaling with frame generation results from Nvidia GPUs. Those are the lighter green lines, and across all 4 GPUs, frame gen really doesn't do much for overall performance. It's slightly slower average FPS on the 4090 and 4060 and basically the same performance on the 4070 and 4080 Super. Minimums improve by the raw metric, but remember to cut those in half to get how the game feels. So for example, the 4090 goes from running at 187 FPS with stuttering down in the 106 FPS range, to looking like it's running at 178 FPS with 121 FPS minimums that actually feel like 60 FPS. Hopefully that makes sense, but as we've stated on numerous occasions, frame generation is far more about marketing than about truly improving the gaming experience. The best case scenario for frame gen is if you're watching someone else play a game. Then you'll see the frame smoothing benefits without having to feel the additional input lag. And that's a wrap for Witchfire. As stated at the beginning, this is really just a snapshot in time of how the game runs, with testing done on October 14th and 15th in 2024. Things can and will change as long as the game remains in active development. As to when the devs will focus more on ironing out some of the performance issues we noted here, that remains to be seen. We hope you enjoyed our video and that you found a bit more peace and harmony in your life by watching. Let us know in the comments what else you'd like to see tested. And as always, please like, share, and subscribe because it really does help to support our channel. Ta-ta for now, and we'll be back again with more Gaming Nerdvana soon.